In 2025, Iran is confronting an unprecedented water crisis. A confluence of severe drought, overuse of resources and decades of mismanagement has left millions of Iranians without reliable access to water. The country, once home to abundant rivers and fertile plains, is now facing a dire shortage of the most basic resource needed for survival. Across Iran, the water crisis has reached critical levels. In the capital city of Tehran, which is home to over 15 million people, the situation is particularly grim. Several reservoirs that supply the city are now at dangerously low levels, and authorities have warned that they may be forced to ration water in the coming months if the drought continues. If it doesn't rain, we will have to start restricting water supplies. Masoud Pezeshkian, president of Iran, Tehran's 5 main reservoirs, once a reliable source of water for millions, have fallen to alarmingly low levels. A recent report from satellite imagery shows these reservoirs are now operating at near-empty levels, unable to meet the growing demand for water in the capital. In response to the dwindling water supply, city officials have begun to implement measures such as lowering water pressure and, in some areas, completely cutting off access during the night. For the citizens of Tehran, water is no longer a given. It has become a scarce commodity, with many households depending on private water deliveries. The water crisis extends far beyond Tehran. In Mashhad, Iran's second-largest city, the situation is just as dire. Reservoirs in the region are reported to be below 3% capacity, a startling figure that underlines the severity of the crisis. Water levels are critically low across many regions of Iran, and urgent action is needed to prevent further damage to both the population and the environment. Environmental analyst. The impact of the water shortage is most acutely felt in rural areas and agricultural zones, which rely heavily on irrigation. Farmers across the country are losing their crops, with entire harvests ruined as a result of water scarcity. In some regions, once thriving farmlands are turning into barren wastelands, unable to support even basic crops. Iran's water crisis is not a result of a sudden environmental disaster, but a slow-burning problem years in the making. For decades, Iran's water resources have been mismanaged, and the country's approach to water use has prioritized short-term gains over long-term sustainability. Iran is located in one of the world's driest regions, and it has long struggled with a natural shortage of water. However, the country's water problems have been exacerbated by a series of poor policy decisions. These include the construction of large-scale irrigation projects, the over-extraction of groundwater, and the failure to invest in water-saving technologies. The water crisis is a direct result of decades of mismanagement and neglect. The country's water resources were overexploited, and little was done to ensure sustainable management. Water resource expert. One of the main culprits of Iran's water crisis is the overuse of its aquifers. Groundwater, which is a vital source of water for both drinking and irrigation, is being extracted at rates far exceeding its natural replenishment. As a result, Iran's aquifers are rapidly depleting, and many wells across the country have run dry. Moreover, agriculture consumes over 90% of Iran's water, despite the fact that the agricultural sector only contributes a small portion to the country's GDP. This inefficient use of water has put an enormous strain on the country's resources, especially in light of the increasing demand from a growing population. The current water crisis is symptomatic of a broader systemic collapse in Iran's water management practices. The country's water infrastructure, which includes dams, reservoirs and irrigation systems, is aging and inefficient. Despite the growing pressures on the country's water resources, Iran's authorities have failed to make the necessary reforms. Iran's water management system is simply not equipped to handle the pressures of modern-day demands. Decades of outdated practices have left the country vulnerable to droughts and other environmental challenges. Water systems analyst. At the same time, climate change has exacerbated the situation. Rising temperatures and increasingly erratic rainfall patterns have made droughts more frequent and more severe. In some regions, entire rivers have dried up, leaving towns and cities reliant on what little groundwater remains. The human impact of the water crisis cannot be overstated. As water supplies dwindle, Iranians are being forced to adapt in ways that were once unimaginable. Rural communities, particularly in agricultural areas, are suffering the most. Farmers who once depended on irrigation for their livelihoods are now losing their crops and facing financial ruin. In response, Farmers in several provinces have staged protests demanding that the government take action to address their water shortages. These protests, particularly in areas like Isfahan and Khuzestan, have turned into calls for the government to prioritise water rights and distribution. Our water rights are being denied and our crops are dying. If the government does not act soon, we will have no choice but to take further action. Farmer from Isfahan. As tensions rise over water scarcity, Iran is also experiencing a growing number of cases of land subsidence and soil degradation. In areas where groundwater extraction has been most intense, the land is sinking, which further complicates the country's already fragile water systems. These environmental disasters only add to the mounting social unrest across the nation. The Iranian government has acknowledged the severity of the situation, and officials have issued warnings about the possibility of day zero, the moment when taps may run dry for millions of people. If the situation does not improve, we will have to take drastic measures, including the evacuation of some parts of the city. Masoud Pezeshkian, President of Iran. In the face of worsening water shortages, the government has begun to implement water rationing measures. These include reducing water pressure, limiting supply to certain areas, and distributing water through tanker trucks. Some officials have also called for urgent reforms to Iran's water management systems, though the pace of change has been slow. Despite these efforts, many experts argue that the government's response has been insufficient and that much more needs to be done to address the root causes of the water crisis. Short-term measures such as rationing and cloud seeding may provide some relief, but they cannot reverse the damage done by years of poor water management. Iran's water crisis has also drawn international attention. Countries and organizations that are concerned about the environmental and humanitarian impact of the crisis have begun to offer assistance. Some experts have pointed to the potential for international cooperation to address the crisis, especially with regard to managing shared water resources in the region. However, the political realities of the region make such cooperation difficult. Iran has long been wary of international involvement in its internal affairs, particularly when it comes to sensitive issues such as water and natural resources. Despite this, many argue that Iran cannot solve the crisis alone and will need the support of international actors in order to build a more sustainable water future. As Iran struggles to cope with the water crisis, the country's future remains uncertain. The government's attempts to address the issue are hampered by a combination of outdated policies, insufficient infrastructure, and the growing impacts of climate change. The situation will likely worsen unless Iran takes decisive action to reform its water management systems and invest in sustainable practices. This is not just an environmental crisis, it is a crisis of governance. Iran must act now to secure its water future. Environmental policy expert. In the coming years, the Iranian government will face increasing pressure to implement long-term solutions that address the root causes of the crisis. Whether Iran will be able to adapt in time to avert further disaster remains to be seen. Iran's water crisis is a ticking time bomb. The consequences of inaction are dire: a collapse of the country's agricultural sector, widespread social unrest, and the potential for mass displacement. Without swift and decisive action, Iran's water crisis could spiral into an even greater humanitarian disaster. For the millions of Iranians who rely on a steady supply of water for their daily survival, the question remains, will their government act in time to prevent a total collapse?